Diablo 4 did an interesting thing with how you customize the powers of your character over the course of the game. They took a standard design problem and went the extra mile with the solution. Mainly, I want to point out how good I think that particular design element is, but in doing so, I think they made a huge mistake that drags the whole game down. A very fixable mistake though, so I'll say a little bit about that too. Before talking about a solution to a design problem, we have to talk about the context and what the problem is that we're even trying to solve. Diablo is a game about building and progressing your character. It's analogous to a card game where you build a deck. Your deck is only so big. You can only choose a limited number of abilities and powers for your character, but you get a bigger and bigger set to choose from as you play through the game. Let's think about two ends of the spectrum that the designers could choose and how easy it is to get the various powers that you use to build your deck out of. So on the one hand, they could give you the entire set of everything instantly. The first moment you start playing, you have access to every power and ability in the entire game, and you can build whatever you want immediately. On the other end of the spectrum, you start with a generic attack only, and then everything that you get after that is totally random. So let's think about each one. First, imagine if you got everything instantly. You could build your character however you wanted right out of the gate. Now, if we were talking about a competitive multiplayer game, that's fine. That's really more than fine. It's actually the bare minimum of what anyone should demand. If we are playing chess or something, I expect to have all of the pieces immediately. No grinding, no chess pieces in random packs, no playing with half the pieces against other players that have only half the pieces. That whole thing is a waste of time and it undermines the concept of an even play field. Diablo is a completely different story though. In a competitive multiplayer focused game, you are ready to start playing when you have access to everything. But in a game like Diablo, you're ready to stop playing at that point. Diablo is primarily a single player game or cooperative player versus environment game. The game is the journey of progressing and tinkering with your character. At some point, when you have pretty much everything, you're probably ready to start over with another character or a new season that has new mechanics, or take a break from the game and play something else entirely. That's fine. What about the opposite? What about starting with nothing and getting everything randomly? Kill 2 monsters and get a fireball spell maybe, or kill 1 billion monsters and maybe you still don't get it. Have no defense spells? Tough luck. Your friend only happened to get defense spells with no decent way to attack. Though this kind of thing is more within keeping of the point of Diablo, it's just needlessly frustrating. It would be a bad experience for most players because it would just be way too likely to be stuck and unable to make an even minimally competent and coherent character. The answer to this is no difficult thing to figure out though. Basically every game of this sort has a simple answer. Both extremes of the spectrum are bad, and so you want to be somewhere in the middle. In Diablo, you pick a class like Barbarian or Sorcerer or whatever, and you get a set of moves for that class that are not random. Each time you level up, you get more of them. In Diablo 3, you get all of your abilities in a set order that's chosen by the game designers. In Diablo 4, you get an ability point each time you level up, and then you spend it in a talent tree. The talent tree is a coherent thing created by game designers. So the point is, if you're a barbarian, you definitely get a coherent set of barbarian abilities as you go. And the randomness comes from the gear that drops from monsters. That gear might give you even more abilities, but those are supplemental. You don't need to rely entirely on those randomly dropping abilities. Now that that's sorted out, here's the issue. Suppose that we're interested in a particular power that's pretty powerful and important. It's build defining, we'll say, and that you could build your whole character around it. Well, that's cool. So which category should it be in? Should it be baked into our class and we get it non-randomly? Or should it be on a piece of gear that might be rare and difficult to get? If we put it on loot that you have to find randomly, people might complain that they want to play this build, but they can't. Shouldn't it not be locked away like that, they'll say? But if you require that all such powers are accessible to your class non-randomly, then people are going to say that the loot feels boring. They'll say they want loot that gives you unique and exciting powers, so it's exciting whenever something new drops. And I think every game of this sort struggles with the tension between those two things. The way Diablo 4 handles that tension is where I'm saying they went the extra mile. And here's how that works. There's all the powers that you get non-randomly from your class, and then there's everything else. That everything else they broke up into multiple subcategories though. Yes, there's the big category of powers, which Diablo 4 calls aspects. that you get randomly from gear, but there's another category of aspects that you get non-randomly by completing various dungeons. So if you want any of those, and there's a lot, there's over 100 of them, you can go directly to that dungeon and beat it, and then you can get that aspect non-randomly. And you actually unlock it forever at that point. You can keep imprinting it on new pieces of gear over and over. They don't want to make all the aspects available non-randomly like that to you, though, because they're trying to keep the loot slot machine full of possibly exciting stuff. But on the other hand, they want to help you make a coherent build by increasing the size of the card pool, so to speak. And that's composed of the class abilities you get non-randomly, plus the aspects that you get from these dungeons non-randomly. And there's more. Blizzard is obviously very concerned with keeping you as interested as they can over the many hours of playing your character. For levels 1 through 50, you get an ability point at each level, giving you new powers. There's also all those dungeons you can do to unlock more aspects. But how can we squeeze more out of the slot machine part of the game to make it interesting for longer? The answer is that there's more tiers to the slot machine that they hold back until later. You start the game on either World Tier 1 or 2 difficulty, you choose which one, and you can't switch until World Tier 3 difficulty until you beat a specific so-called capstone dungeon. You usually do that about level 40 or so. Beating that and getting to World Tier 3 difficulty means that the loot slot machine now contains more possible items it can give out. Items that are called unique by Diablo 4. They're really just more powers, but they're usually things that try to be especially powerful and build defining. The reason they're doing this is that you're expected to keep tinkering and changing your build as you go, but once you have all your ability points, all the non-random aspects that you need from dungeons, and you've found enough of the random aspects from drops too, you might not change much after that. So adding in this new pool of gear that you can't possibly get until that point makes it more likely that you're going to find something cool and keep tinkering. And there's more when you beat another capstone dungeon, which you usually do around level 60 or so. It has level 70 enemies. You can unlock the World Tier 4 difficulty, and that adds even more unique items to that loot slot machine. So again, even this late in your progression, there's still new toys that you couldn't possibly have had earlier. That's even another step here, and I think something that wasn't quite fully baked when the game launched. The unique items in that last step I mentioned don't all have the same probability to drop. There's a few that are just insanely rare, way more rare than the others. So rare that when the game launched, they just didn't exist because only a few of the millions of players of this game even saw it at all. I get the thinking, though. It's really two things. First, it ensures that there's pretty much always going to be some new toy that you might be able to get. But the half-baked part that I think they're still working on is that it allows them to add new activities or chains of event that allow you to have a pretty good chance to get these uber uniques. For example, in Season 2, they added 5 new bosses, and there's a whole progression system where you farm resources to be able to fight a certain 2 of those bosses, even just once. And then when you beat them, they drop materials that you can combine that let you fight Duriel, who is the final boss of the season, and then he increases the chances of getting those uber uniques by a huge amount when you beat him. This is analogous to adding another world tier of difficulty and opening up a new set of items in the slot machine. So that's kind of what they're going for. So in summary, I totally get the progression here. It starts out with non-random abilities that are kind of your base. And then there's several steps where each step gives you more possible new random toys to play with so things don't get stale. It's hard to talk about this without talking about what I think is a huge mistake on Blizzard's part, though. But before I cover that huge mistake, let me tell you that you are making a huge mistake by not checking out my tabletop game, Pandante. It's sort of like poker, except it's still fun when you don't use real money. And it's all about lying about your hand and trying to maneuver to get the hand you lied about for real or to bluff other people to pretend that you got it. Usually there's a lot of laughing and good times, so it's a very social game. You can get it at sirloingames.com in either the standard or the deluxe form with fancy clay chips. Back to Diablo 4's big mistake. I'm sure it sounded good on paper. Your character's deck only holds so many of these various magical aspects. Okay, that's fine. But it's not like, here's 10 slots and just pick any 10 cards and put them in the slots. No, each one has to be imprinted on a specific piece of gear. One goes on your gloves, another one goes on your boots. What if you have one that you want attached to your gloves, but then you get better gloves that have better stats? You cannot just freely transfer the aspect from the first gloves to the second gloves. You can extract the magical aspect from the old gloves and then put it on the new gloves once. but you cannot extract it again and then put it on yet another new piece of gear. So you need to keep finding more copies of the gear that has the aspects that you need so that you can break them down and then transfer them to other things. You have to have enough copies of that aspect to keep putting it on new gear. And all these copies have different roles, by the way. Like one might add lightning damage that does between 400 and 700 damage or something. And you have one copy that adds 400 damage and another that adds 600, and you have to track all that. Here's the point though. In actually playing this game, the experience is being inundated with dozens and dozens of inventory items that are all devoted to these aspects. Random junk items that just have a copy of the aspect that you want on them. You have to store them, and it's tedious to deal with them all. It's tedious to find the ones that you want, even if you have them. But way worse than that, you have nowhere near the inventory space that you need. And I cannot emphasize that enough. You have nowhere near the inventory space that you need. If you had double the space, it would be laughably too little. All of your characters, and you can have like 12 of them now, have to share the same tiny amount of stash space. It just makes it unworkable to store the items for several characters. I think if they multiplied the inventory space by 10, it wouldn't really be enough, given that it's all shared between those characters. It is oppressively little space. The experience of playing Diablo 4 is really defined by looking through massive amounts of gear, almost of which is all garbage, in order to find the few things to keep, which you then don't have room to store. So then you have to go through all the things you're storing and figure out which ones you can part with, maybe which entire character you were saving gear on to just give up on, just to make room for this one new thing. It's miserable, it's unfun, it's tedious. A lot of the game is miserable, unfun, and tedious, specifically because of this. People bought this game to fight monsters and tinker with their characters, not to manage mounds of garbage in a tiny microscopic inventory. The problem is so bad and so game ruining that I know Blizzard is fully aware. I saw their project lead in an early stream mention something like, "We just have to weigh if the fun of finding a good role on a given aspect is worth the hassle of managing the inventory of it." And the moment I saw that, I knew it was over. I can imagine someone running the project and just being completely oblivious to this problem. But what I cannot imagine is someone with the awareness to ask the question that he did, and yet who ends up saying, yeah, it's worth it. No, it's not. It is not worth it, okay? I know it, and Diablo forums know it and voice it very loudly. The only question in my mind is, will this be fixed or addressed before I post this video or after? You know, there's a lag time between when I shoot this and when I post it, and maybe they've already addressed it by the time you're seeing this. Who knows? Maybe Blizzard has already saved us from this inventory hell by the time you're seeing this. The obvious answer to this issue that you can read about 100 times over in every Diablo forum is that the aspects should not take up inventory space at all. Instead, they should be in the Codex of Power. That's the thing that stores all the aspects that you unlock from doing those dungeons that I talked about earlier. When you find an aspect on a piece of gear, one way or another, it should unlock the associated power in the Codex. That already has a good UI to see all the powers, and it uses 0 inventory space. Yeah, there's a lot of different ways to implement that idea, but I'm not going to bother to enumerate all the ways that it could work. The problem is so bad that hopefully by the time I'm posting this or shortly thereafter, Blizzard picked one of the many put all the aspects in the Codex of Power solutions and implemented it. Anyway, the main thing that I wanted to tell you about isn't a rant about the oppressively small amount of inventory space that Diablo 4 has. It's the other stuff about how there's a very careful tiered release of abilities that they've set up to keep having new stuff over dozens of hours of play, and I thought it was a pretty good way of doing things for this style of game.